afternoon. Welcome to this webinar that's hosted by the Institute for Economic Justice, which is a second webinar in the series of Feminism in Focus and thinking about post-COVID realities. Today's webinar is going to be about social provisioning and the Universal Basic Income Grant, which is something that's gaining a lot of debate and discussion in South Africa at the moment. We know that South Africa has one of the most relatively well-established social welfare systems in the world. And as an example, the Child Support Grant supports over 12 million children every month. But we know that that has its limitations, and that has come out particularly during this COVID period when a relatively large proportion of households have been left vulnerable to the effects of the pandemic. We know that social transfers have been, the positive effects of social transfers have been very well documented. And this has formed the basis for the call, particularly by civil society and those in academia, for the introduction of a universal basic income grant. So what we are going to do today is to discuss what this means, particularly from a gender perspective. And I've got two researchers here with us today. Natasha Valley, who is a lecturer at the Department of Sociology at the University of Cape Town, and Sasha Knox, who is an independent researcher working in the areas of critical political economies. We are going to start our discussion with Natasha, who's going to give us her reflections on this topic. And then we'll follow this up with Sasha, and thereafter we'll have a brief discussion sessions, and then we'll open up to the rest of the audience for questions and further engagements. So I'm going to give it up to you, Natasha. Please really start your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Winnie, and thanks to the IEJ for allowing us the space to talk about this. And also, I wanted to say, Sasha, I hope I can take the liberty of doing this, is to say that both Sasha and I are also members of the grant subgroup of the C19 coalition, and a lot of the points we make mirror those that people in the grant subgroup have been making, particularly using the hashtag on social media, #PayTheGrants, #PayTheGrants. So if you want to kind of see what's happening around broader conversations around state social assistance, particularly during this moment of pandemic, you can have a look for it using that hashtag #PayTheGrants. So I wanted to start off by saying it can be tempting to feel like this is a new discussion, but in many ways this conversation about an income guarantee is an old discussion. It's an old discussion globally, and it's also a discussion that's been had more than 2 decades ago in this country. And I wanted to switch my hat a little bit here from a researcher to teacher. And recently I've been teaching the Wages for Housework campaign of the 1970s, a feminist campaign that called for wages for housework. And one recalls theorists like Silvia Federici and Maria Rosa de la Costa and Selma James and Kathy Weeks and others. And I think that it's very valuable for us to, as feminists, look at histories of struggle and histories of demands so that we can learn about what worked, what didn't work, what the purposes of struggles that have similarities to current struggles, what they can teach us and what they can allow us the space to move from. So I want to talk about the first part, which is that wages for housework was a demand in the same way that income guarantee, basic income guarantee, is a demand. And demands do a lot more than on the surface one kind of imagines them to be doing. Demanding makes visible things that are invisible. So in the Wages for Housework campaign, it visibilized to many who purposefully chose not to see the immense amount of labor that women were doing in the home, immense amount of work that women were doing. So it visibilized the work women were doing. But it also allowed debates, discussions like this one, critique about what was actually not functioning or working about the status quo. So a demand including the basic income grant, I really think needs to be seen in this context. We, to our own detriment, become myopic about what would it mean? How many hundreds of thousands of rands here? When would this be paid? What is the date? And actually, what this demand is permitting us the space to do is to really question some fundamentals about a system that is not working. So similarly to the Wages for Housework campaign, the demand for UBIG is asking us, what is work? What counts as work? Whose work is valued? Why is wage labor failing? And what is the basic income grant aiming to do that what we currently have in place isn't doing? So it's allowing us to really talk about these broader kind of questions that land us in this place. And I think we also, I know Winnie in the introduction, you said that we were giving a gendered perspective, and I think that that is obviously going to come up in our comments and is fundamental. But I think that I also want to push for a feminist perspective, because the feminist perspective is not only about women speaking, or about how a basic income grant would affect women, but it's about talking about structural inequality. And fundamental injustices in the system, right? And so I really want to push for, yes, for representation, because oftentimes, even if they're the most progressive, you have a lot of men talking about a basic income grant, right? So I'm pushing for representation. It's really important that we have women talking about this and talking about how this will affect women. But we also need to think about what a feminist perspective on a basic income grant could be. That is beyond just talking about impacts on women. And then I know a lot of things will come up in the questions, both from yourself, Winnie, and from the attendees. But I think we also need to acknowledge that I'm not a cheerleader for a basic income grant in that I think that this is the thing that is going to solve all the fundamental injustices and problems with the current structures, because I like to think of a basic income grant as a really important and interesting tool to allow us the space and time to work to make fundamental changes in our society. And I hope to get back to that question of time and a basic income grant's connection to making time available in a bit. But I think that a basic income grant should never be seen as a silver bullet or as the panacea. And this is something that the Pay the Grants campaign has been saying. And I just wanted to read a little bit from the Pay the Grant campaign's call for basic income grant, which says, any change needs to include collective decision-making, sharing in all natural resources in a way that holds climate justice as central, sharing the labor of care and economic redistribution. It needs to include migrants, those living with disabilities, queer people, and all those who are excluded in multiple ways. A guaranteed income security must be complemented by a strong, accessible public service kind of structure platform. It must be complemented by affordable housing and universal healthcare. It is not separate from a critical need for a framework for the creation of value that is underpinned by human development, rather than just about money as being the thing that we need to redistribute. And so just to finish off this little introduction part, I wanted to say that redistribution needs to be thought of in broader, more creative, more interesting, and more radical ways than economic. And I'm hoping that a feminist perspective is the perspective that allows us the space to imagine these redistributive possibilities. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Very interesting points that that you've raised, particularly around work and what is considered work and what is valued as work, and how that all links up to the household. I'm going to move on to Sasha now and allow her to present her reflections, and then we're going to go into the broader discussions around the issues that you will have brought up to you in your presentations. Thanks. Welcome, Sasha.
Sorry, I'm starting on mute. But thank you for the introduction, Winnie. I just want to mention offhand that my pronouns are they, their, or them. But I'm very thankful to the IEJ for the space, and it's wonderful to be in conversation with Natasha. I've got a lot of respect for her as a colleague, and I think even us being here kind of is quite a feminist moment in itself, because it kind of unhinges this white, cis, hetero, patriarchal kind of expertise, right? You know, whether or not we are usually the people having these conversations and occupying these spaces, you know, that's a little bit up for debate in terms of our different identities and positionalities. So I'm really thankful, and I think, you know, even acknowledging that the structure is quite a feminist perspective. I am kind of, so I've left things fairly unstructured. I kind of wanted to jump off from Natasha. I mean, I think that a place I always start, and I'll probably do the same here, is just to draw a bit of a picture about how dire the situation in South Africa actually is. And this is partly in response to you know, this idea that we have this really advanced social protection system. I really think that that's an idea that needs to be challenged and unpacked a little bit, and we can hopefully do that a bit more in the questions. But just to state that before the pandemic, things were incredibly dire in South Africa. You know, and the COVID-19 catastrophe has kind of been a catastrophe waiting to happen. You know, I mean, we've seen just like very sluggish growth, mass unemployment, and massively worsening inequality, you know, since the kind of year days. The economic models that we are using are simply not working, you know, and 2008 should have been a moment for us to reassess some of those frameworks because it was so obvious that they had failed. You know, so that was a kind of missed opportunity. It hasn't manifested in that way, and I think COVID-19 is something similar. It really shows the crisis of our existing systems and the fact that they aren't sustainable. Yeah, I mean, before the COVID-19 crisis, you know, we have poverty lines in South Africa which measure, supposedly measure where people sit in terms of poverty in this country. So before the pandemic, 64.2% of Black South Africans were living below the upper bound poverty line. So that means that 64.2% of Black South Africans had less than 1,227 Rand in their pocket each month. I mean, it's shocking. Our malnutrition, we have a severe malnutrition crisis as well, where stunting in children kind of goes up to about 30%, I think. So that means that there are, you know, cognitive impacts for that. It's a very severe and very dire situation. It's been massively exacerbated by the kind of COVID-19 context. And I know that a lot of commentators have been throwing out some of the NIDS-CRAM findings and data. But I mean, some of those things, just to rattle off a couple of figures, half of all households ran out of money to buy food in April. And that makes sense. PMB, JED have done some research around how the poorest people in South Africa are now paying up to 30% more for food. And that kind of combined with taxi fare hikes, in those ways, you start to see the way that the poor are disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 context. But yeah, some of the other, I mean, 3 million people lost their jobs since February 2020, and there's been an 18% decline in employment. 1 in 3 people lost their income, and out of the 3 million job losses, 2 million of those job losses were from women. So what you see is that pre-existing inequalities have really grown during the COVID-19 pandemic. Job losses and income losses have been heavily concentrated among the already disadvantaged. So you see Black Africans, low wage earners, manual laborers, and women experiencing the greatest losses. I just want to say that when I speak of women, I'm using women with an X because I think that's something important for this conversation is obviously feminized forms of labor. But I think that there's gender diversity even in terms of who occupies spaces of feminized forms of labor. So for example, you might have a trans woman who performs all the feminized forms of labor that a cisgendered woman would perform. So I think that we really just need to bear in mind that, you know, when I'm speaking about women, I'm not just speaking about cisgendered women. And this is feminist work, you know, as Natasha was saying, it's visibilizing the invisible. It's reminding the system that there are these points of tension and there are these exclusions that exist. So we have a very patriarchal, cis and heteronormative society. And from no small degree, we've inherited that from our colonial and apartheid past, right? So, you know, our policies of redistributive justice and economic modeling, all of that. I mean, it's basically failed. People are living in, you know, really abject poverty and really being condemned to live lives without any forms of dignity. You know, it's a very visceral thing. And it's in a very, very embodied thing. And I can get into that a little bit later. But basically, until we start to see structural reform of the systems of oppression, we're unlikely to see any change. So I think that applying a feminist perspective to economics is part of that structural reform that we need to see. And I think that a UBIG is a really important component of that, because it would mean essentially wages for, I don't even want to say care work, because that sounds really kind of soft and nice, and care work is hard work, it's grueling work, and it actually socially reproduces the economy. So, you know, if anyone is watching this conversation, they're a bit unsure of what we mean by unpaid labor. You know, this is, and I'm just going to hold it up to the screen, but this is something that we engaged with in IEJ's Feminist Economics Summer School, and it's just looking at women's unseen contributions to the extractive industries in South Africa. You know, this is like a tangible example of looking at how the whole mining industry is basically sustained by the labor of women, and women with an X. You know, we live in the most unequal country in the world. I've kind of painted a little bit of a picture about how dire that situation is. But we also live in a country where we have some of the highest rates of gender-based violence and femicide in the world. And I don't think that that is a coincidence. I think that what we have tended to lean towards is the defining of who is entitled to be a citizen, who is entitled to access their rights around this concept of paid for labor. So if you earn a wage, you garner respect, you are seen as human, you are seen as, you know, occupying space and having needs, having rights. When you are outside of that system, there's kind of a representation crisis that happens, because people are excluded from the system, and then the system continues and it kind of looks at itself and it says, well, you know, those people aren't within here, so their perspective isn't really needed, you know, and it becomes this kind of vicious self-reinforcing cycle. But yeah, I really feel like you know, women are not really able, women with an X are not really able to access wage labor and to access this positionality of a South African citizen with rights. And because of that, I think that there is something there that where, you know, full humanity is not conferred upon women in this country. And then when you realize that we have this GBV femicide pandemic, it makes sense, you know, there's a dehumanization that happens there. And actually it's very strategic systems of oppression, because if you look at how the so-called informal economy structures and socially reproduces the formal economy. Yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I was just about to jump to some notes, but I mean, it's that unpaid labor is required in order for the capitalist system to function in the way that it does. You know, for example, the extractive industries require the unpaid for labor of women with an X in order to function. And, you know, you think about how much these kinds of labor actually contribute to the economy. I think there was a paper published in 2010, and it was Counting Women's Work or something like that, but it was talking about how at the time, these forms of labor constituted 27.3% of GDP. That's a massive chunk of your GDP. And, I think a lot of, kind of hardcore economists don't want to look at what they think are like these soft issues. But to me, there's a lack of rigor there, because if you are seriously concerned with the economy, then you should be concerned with what produces and sustains the economy. If you are a serious economist, you need to be looking at this whole section of labor that actually socially reproduces it. But the point is, and this is kind of why I started with a picture of the vulnerabilities in South Africa, because I think a lot of the speak around COVID has been around acknowledging, just acknowledging some of these vulnerabilities, right? But what we're actually seeing, despite talk of increased protection of people with comorbidities or disabled people or whatever the case is, that hasn't been a reality. I mean, there's absolutely no adequate social protection at this time for the great majority of South Africans, and even people who were accessing things like the disability grant. There was frustration with that process, and they were told instead to get the special COVID grant. So. Although there's a lot of speak around protecting the vulnerable and acknowledging vulnerability, there is we aren't really seeing that in practice. And that's really disappointing. I mean, it's a massively missed opportunity for some of that restructuring to happen. But I do think that this kind of labor and this tendency to see paid and unpaid labor as completely different, as completely separate, which they aren't, is part of sustaining the system, which actually needs to kind of vampirically take that labor without compensating for it. So I do think that a basic income grant is incredibly important in terms of addressing some of the unpaid labor that exists in this country. And it's really not only for that, but also because, people are being condemned to these kind of almost living death existences at the moment. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought again, but when people are, placed in these situations, there is no option for their escape from these systems. Even when people are making opportunities for themselves in terms of like informal labor, they're still categorized as informal. But you have this whole system that confers wealth and value on who you are as a human being. And then the majority of South Africans are told that they're not even allowed to access that system that confers worth. I mean, what does that do psychologically, mentally to people in this country? Never mind the fact that people are carrying massive trauma from a past which is not a past which is still very much a present. The mental health impacts and benefits of a basic income grant, I think, are a really strong argument for it. How am I doing for time, Winnie? I need to wrap up.
Yes, please. I think that would be great.
I mean, I think that, really just highlighting the missed opportunity for the creation of alternative realities. And, it shouldn't be this case of, I earlier said applying feminism to economics, but economics should be, I think, a feminist practice. Because when you look at what feminism is, there's a statement, and I don't want to misquote it, but it's feminism is intersectional, or it's bullshit, right? And this is Flavia Zonda, a quote from Flavia Zonda. What that means is that you are looking at the complexity of human beings. You are looking at all of the oppressions that needs an expanded view, and open up view, not a view that is excluding, right? And I think so much of feminist work is still trying to prove that racism, feminism, racism, sexism, whatever the case, actually exists, and it's these barriers. Saba Ahmed describes it as these barriers we have to continually kind of push against. If you think of a non-binary person, the way they have to engage with the world, if you think of people who are oppressed and the labor of
it seems like we are losing you a bit. We can't hear you clearly. Perhaps you could repeat the last statement and then we move on to the discussion session. Yeah.
So I think that's something that's really important for me is basically that people are working all the time. And especially when you are oppressed, when you are excluded from a system, you have to do the labor of trying to be included into that system. So doing things like protesting is a labor. So you really get all these people to a certain position where they can't access alternative options. And then when they're performing these incredible forms of labor to try and access everything in their lives, those forms of labor are still not being recognized. I think a BIG is really important in this regard. I really wish that we could see some of the thinking of like Sarah Ahmed, Sylvia Winter. You know, there's so many fantastic women of color in particular who have written so much on these topics. And when feminism is about expanding your views, to me that's about a kind of scientific rigor. And that scientific rigor should be seen as essential.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. I mean, thanks for reminding us about why a universal basic income grant is needed in this country, and reminding us of the vulnerabilities, and in particular how women and women are affected, and the complexities around that. But I think I want to pick up on the issue of work that you both raised. The issue of labor force participation, women in paid versus unpaid care work, care or in domestic work, and so forth. And my question would be, from a feminist perspective, do we think that the universal basic income grant is the solution? Some people might argue that creating employment opportunities might be the way to go. Increasing the supply of employment in the market and so forth. But there are others who also argue that having a basic income grant basically entrenches women or emphasizes the gender divisions of labor, in the sense of women are the ones who've been disproportionately carrying the burden of care work. And so providing a basic income grant basically pushes them towards that and away from participating in the labor market like they would want to. So my question would be to both of you, and maybe we can start with Natasha. Do you think that basic income grants will change the gender divisions of labor, allow women to have make the decisions on whether to participate in the labor market or not? Or do you think that it will further entrench this gender divisions of labor that we know are quite prominent?
Thanks, Winnie. Well, we don't need to rely on what I think here, because there's countless numbers of pilot studies and research that's been done to show that an income guarantee, in fact, increases work-seeking behavior by women outside the home. It certainly doesn't, and in general, in fact. So the idea that an income guarantee makes people lazy or not want to look for work is a fallacy. It's just not the case. People, in fact, look for work to a greater degree. For example, you can just think about a woman who is having to provide to look after her child, and therefore is not able to look for work. The second she's able to afford somebody to assist her with caring for her child, she's able to then look for work. Or she has taxi fare to go and look for work, or to print out a CV. So, I mean, there are very many practical examples one can give. But I think possibly more importantly than us trying to make an argument about whether or not this leads to people looking for work or not looking for work, is the point that there is no work, right? So you can look all you want, but if there's no work, your seeking of work is not going to make it appear. So let's just talk about what we mean when we say there's no work. I know that Sasha's spoken about it a little bit, but we mean first that there are no jobs, but we also mean that there are no good quality jobs. That means jobs that provide the kind of income security that makes a life a good life, right? And so some of the stats are really, really startling, but we have an unemployment rate of 40%, more so post-pandemic. For those people who have work, and this is full-time work, 54% of those still earn below 4,100 Rand. Even the people who are in full-time employment still earn below the working poor line, right? The 60% of workers who are in non-standard employment, so that is short-term with no medical aid, with sketchy contracts, if there's a contract, they certainly are not secure above the working poor poverty line. So I think we need to stop assuming that work as it currently is going to be the solution, because even if people have full-time employment, it is not sufficient. And the rest of the work is precarious and in many ways undignified. So we need to stop equating wage labor with economic security, right? And I think that I understand it. We've got a large amount of social pressure that equates dignity with work, certain kinds of wage work, and it's a lot to. It takes a lot of really questioning what we've been told all our lives and what we've constantly been fed to disconnect wage labor to disconnect just purely equating wage labor with dignity and to equating wage labor with economic security. So, and let me say that most of the precarious workers are women, and that's in paid employment, and we know that there's a lot of unpaid work that goes on. So that's the part about should we rather create jobs instead of a basic income grant. A basic income guarantee does something really important for women in the workplace, which is that it allows women a certain amount of space to bargain in the workplace, which is fundamental. It allows people to do that, but in particular, I'm speaking about women here. It allows people a certain amount of space to say, no, actually, I'm not going to take this shitty job. Like, I just refuse, because there is a small kind of adequate cushioning provided by a basic income grant. It acknowledges those parts of society that should be considered work in the first place as work. So, for example, sex workers have been really detrimentally affected during this period of the pandemic. They, of course, can't apply for UIF TERS because what they do is not considered work. Sex workers are disproportionately women. And they've found themselves in a situation where they can't continue doing the work that they were doing pre-pandemic during the period of lockdown, and yet they can't access those kind of emergency temporary resources put in place in the interim. So an income guarantee would have provided that cushion for people whose work is otherwise not considered work. And I guess I can speak more about if you'd want me to speak more about the impact of women, the impact of a basic income grant on the lives of women further than employment. Should I do that?
Yeah, that would be great. But I think let's just go to Sasha to respond on the question of work, and then we'll get back to the question of the positive or the effects of on other aspects of women's lives. Last, Sasha.
Thanks, Winnie. I mean, Natasha, I think you've put that really beautifully. I mean, for me, again, I would, just kind of expand a little bit on what Natasha was saying, but, this kind of capitalistic neoliberal model of existence is an incredibly ableist model, right? So it excludes people who can't occupy those spaces of wage labor, which people who are differently abled often cannot. But then, I mean, there's a whole host of considerations around that. But then, I mean, with this kind of ableism, it's this mentality of like, you snooze, you lose, right? Lebogang Keko speaks about this, and she's fantastic on feminist economics in South Africa. So really check her out if anyone's interested in this work. But yeah, it's this kind of mentality of you snooze, you lose. You know, if you are in a position of deprivation, that is somehow your fault because you haven't done enough to lift yourself out of that situation, right? So I think that that's also a kind of deliberate structure of oppression that exists, this kind of conceptual narrative, because then we can kind of wash our hands of people who are struggling. You know, it's no longer the state's responsibility to provide redistributive or transformative justice. You know, the onus and the responsibility is on people themselves, you know. So the first thing to look at is how people are excluded, but then the second thing to look at is how people perform labor every day, you know, and for you know, that could be feminized forms of labor where it's this kind of heavy care work. But there are also other things, and I was kind of circling through that at the kind of conclusion of my first part. You know, it's like people who are occupying space in systems that are not built for them, that are deliberately built to exclude them. They have to perform a labor to exist there. They have to constantly push against that system, whether it's through protest or simply by existing. Hi, I'm a non-binary person who use my correct pronouns. You know, each and every interaction, you know, someone has to fight for that space. So this is unrecognized. You know, there are all these forms of unrecognized labor that people in South Africa have to perform all the time. You know, the labor of keeping a family together when people don't have 2 cents to rub together. What does that mean? You know, it's massive. People in South Africa, especially the poor, especially those without, work incredibly hard in so many ways, beyond just creating opportunities for themselves. Although when you provide a UBIG, all of the pilots that Natasha kind of pointed to, all of those prove that people use that money and that income to create further opportunities for themselves. But as soon as there is an opportunity, someone will choose to kind of take that up, you know, and it's not a case of, yeah, I mean, there's so much I can say around this, but I really think that we need to unpack this idea of, you know, it's a bad thing to give people money when they aren't doing work. The fact is people work all the time. And really a UBIG is about a labor.
Thanks, Sasha. So I'm going to go back to Natasha now because we started speaking about the other effects of a UBIG and other aspects of women's life and from a feminist perspective. And as you respond to that, there was also a question from the audience about having a job guarantee program. And this is a question from Julian here, who says that Professor Pavlina Chmeleva has an academic paper from 2018 and a book from 2020. I don't know if any of you is familiar with the work, but they speak about the job guarantee program instead of a universal basic income, giving jobs and so forth. And I know, Natasha, you've spoken a little bit about that when you argue that where are the jobs? You know, there's such high levels of unemployment. How is government going to, or how is the economy going to create these jobs that ensures a guarantee for people to have access to these jobs? But as you speak about the other effects, perhaps you could respond to this question from the audience.
Sure, thanks, Winnie. I think let me respond to that question alongside following up with what Sasha just said, which is that in pilot programs, when people received income guarantees, what would happen in a significant minority of times is that people would pool money and figure out ways of creating there were examples of kind of food gardens, but also other kinds of sustainable ways of working economically. And so people are one could, if you wanted, consider this people creating their own kinds of work, right? And so I think the idea that we create jobs so that we can say we create jobs oftentimes leads to things like badly paid, badly secured, casual labor. And we don't want that to be the case. And we don't also want to nurture a mentality that you have to work in order to get what you deserve. You know, this like deservedness is something we really need to challenge. And a basic income guarantee, like I said at the beginning, not only do we need to think of it as a payment of money of an adequate amount to everybody without a means test, but we also have to think of it as a way of challenging our very idea of who deserves it and who doesn't deserve it. Everybody is going to get this, right? So this is the idea of a universal basic income guarantee. Everybody gets it. You don't have to work. You don't have to do a job. And like Sasha was saying, oftentimes jobs, as we see waged work, are set up for able-bodied men. And so by dismantling the idea that to be a part of society, you have to have a job, we're doing a lot of work of questioning the fundamental underpinnings of a productivist system, of a system that just wants to kind of suck us dry, say what is valuable, what isn't valuable. And so I really would push for an income guarantee over jobs and therefore payment for a job. I think also, like I mentioned, a basic income guarantee would allow women in particular space around employment. I also wanted to speak about something that Sasha mentioned about a basic income guarantee in the pilots having a huge effect on health. Income guarantee not only affects mental health well-being, it affects it affects people making what is it called when you continue on your medication regimen? Compliance. Is that it? Yes, right. Yeah. So it has a huge impact on compliance with medication, and that of course is really important in South Africa with TB and HIV. It's fundamental for mother and child care, so maternal well-being, maternal health. It makes a big impact on that. And so and of course food security, right, which of course has huge impacts on health. And also housing. So we've seen the magnification and intensification of what was already an extremely brutal system for women in households and homes and relationships where there's gender-based violence. And a certain level of a basic income guarantee permits choice. So you can make, to a certain degree, the choice to not live in this situation. The choice to be able to make alternative living arrangements. And in general, that's the point, right? What a BIG does that is feminist and affects women dramatically is that it permits the space for a certain amount of autonomy that not having this income would have prevented. So it enhances the freedom to say no, because choice is not just about saying yes. It permits the space to be able to say no. I don't want to live here. I don't want to work here. I don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have to choose between food or taxi fare to go and get my medication, etc. And importantly, it allows for time. We as women in particular know that you're constantly making trade-offs about, it's not the idea of 8 hours work, 8 hours leisure, 8 hours rest is for many a pipe dream. And what a certain amount of an income guarantee allows is leisure. And leisure doesn't necessarily mean resting and lying about, although it can. It just means choice. You know, do I want to volunteer at this organization? Do I want to learn an instrument? Do I, any number of things constitute leisure. And that's the kind of thing that I think that a redistributive justice needs to take into consideration. So one of the questions that came in the chat box was, isn't the whole point that we failed to do economic redistribution? Yes, we have failed to do post-apartheid economic redistribution, and it's a fundamental part of redistribution. We cannot, like we have been doing, ignore redistribution in economics. And there's really great work out there about progressive taxation systems. I mean, IEJ is doing some of it. But I think a feminist understanding of redistribution has to also talk about things like time, has to also talk about things like pleasure and desire and joy, you know, because we're not just working beings. We're not just here to survive. We also want to be here to live. And a feminist understanding of a redistributive politics, a redistributive emancipatory politics, needs to consider what it would be to redistribute time for everything we want to do.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Now, we've talked a lot about the benefits, but from a household and individual perspectives for women, and mainly because UBIG would actually be an individual, ideally would be an individual and conditional grant paid out to a person. But beyond the household and the individual level, what kind of effects are we likely to see? And perhaps, Sasha, you could respond to this question. Like, what are the multiplier effects we expect at say, the local economic level, or even from, generally on the economy? I think that's also one of the questions that has come up from the audience. I will ask that we keep our responses short, a little bit shorter this time, because we've got quite a number of questions from the audience, and they're all very interesting and relevant to the discussion. Please go on, Sasha.
Yeah, I think what Natasha was saying is incredibly important. I mean, that freedom from domination and oppression, that freedom to say no, you know, particularly when we have this second pandemic of femicide and gender-based violence, and particularly when that's increasing in the COVID-19 context, it's really invaluable. I mean, the second pandemic needs to be addressed with as much force as the first pandemic, and I think Natasha made a really strong case for ways in which a UBIG can do that, or a universe-based income grant. So I will just quickly go to your question, Winnie, and it is an expansion of the previous question as well, because what we find is that I mean, the COVID-19 crisis is really a severe economic crisis from the demand side, right? So rather than crowding out private spending, if you increase basic income, you stimulate demand, which would stimulate investment, because they're going to be higher demands on investment. When people have money in their hands, they're able to positively contribute to GDP because they are consuming. So it addresses some of this demand side crisis, which is quite particular to the pandemic, that exists even before the pandemic as well. When you put money in people's hands, they create opportunities for themselves. They're able to contribute to GDP, and if the amount is substantial enough, it means that this can have exactly an economic multiplier effect, where your spending on this has so many knock-off effects, which positively contributes not only to the GDP, but also to other areas like Natasha's pointed out, areas like health, all sorts of other areas where spending, you know, state spending is important, but lacking at this time. So yeah, I mean, there really is a strong economic argument for a BIG from a feminist perspective, not only to account for all of this labor, but because it makes sense in terms of an economic model where we are looking at more properly implementing redistributive justice because of this multiplier effect, because of the positive impact that would have on GDP, on job creation, and so on, etc. I mean, we might get a bit more into these kind of funding nitty-gritty questions, I think, as we progress. So yeah, maybe let me just wrap up there.
I think you should just respond, since you brought it up. Like, the big question is around financing. Some people argue that the country doesn't have the money to do this, particularly with the negative economic outlook and for the foreseeable future. What would you say about that?
Sasha, can I jump in here?
Yeah, Natasha.
I know Sasha knows a lot is really, how do I say it? Sasha can maybe do some of the more detailed stuff, Sasha, because I know you've done some of the work while you were at SPI. And then I wanted to just say, and I think Sasha and I probably have a similar position on this, which is when we talk about affording something, we first need to talk about, like, we can't afford not to do this. That's the first point, right? And also when we talk about affording, we need to look at the word choices that we use. People often say, how will we afford to do this? Using the word afford is often quite a narrow fiscal position. I just read a Gift of the Givers article that was speaking about the levels of malnutrition in our country that the organization hasn't seen outside of a war zone. And so it sometimes feels a bit callous to be sitting around with spreadsheets when you're seeing people, when you are somebody who's literally starving to death. So I think that needs to be the first thing that we say, which is that when we talk about affording, we also need to perhaps preface it with a more important question, which is what is the most morally just position to take? When there are people starving and there are people living in extreme wealth, then we need to find the money. That's I think the most morally just position. How we afford it actually is more the semantics. We have to afford it. That's the point. So I want to make clear, we first ask what is just, then we ask how do we afford it, instead of saying how do we afford it and then is it just.
Okay. And Sasha, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are many commentators who've looked at some of the issues that Natasha was speaking about.
Sorry, Sasha, we can't hear you clearly.
I was saying another colleague of ours in the Cash Conference subgroup was done by here, and some economic modeling with a colleague of his. I mean, there's a lot of creative thinking around how this could be financed. I want to kind of, we've been kind of floating in the staff group that we should use the KPMG regulations to finance the UBIG in South Africa. They are, I think Natasha makes a really strong point about it being an ethically necessary thing to do, and we take public solutions to provide social protection in the context of natural economic impact for unemployment. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm struggling around the thoughts a little bit and getting into order.
Sorry.
It would be really fantastic to see, I kind of, when we're talking about this, this kind of stereotyping around, well, if we don't, we're not.
Sorry, Sasha. But I don't know whether, Natasha, you were able to make out
Sure.
what Sasha.
Yes. So Sasha, I saw that you were speaking about some of the work that's been done by members of the cash transfer subgroup that both Sasha and I are part of, particularly by Ihsan Basir. And Ihsan is an economist and speaks very and has written very clearly and interestingly, amongst others, he's one of many who've spoken about progressive tax reforms that would be able to finance an income guarantee. That includes a wealth tax, it includes a personal income tax, and it could, during this moment of pandemic, also, one could also think of a solidarity tax. But because the rich in this country are so extremely rich, that a wealth tax would only actually tax a very small percentage of the, I don't have the figures here, but I know Ihsan wrote a really great article, which was speaking about how a very small percent, a 10% increase tax, a 10% tax of the highest 2% of income earners would provide us with something like 40 billion rand. And that's an immense amount of money. And of course, there are things like a climate tax. which is fundamental. We know that the richest create the most pollution. And so that would be another way to possibly finance it. So there are possibilities for financing it. We could spend less on arms, you know, there are many ways that we could make the money for an income guarantee.
Yeah, ask if my audio is better. Were you not able to hear me earlier?
You were coming in and out.
Okay. Can I pick you hear me?
Sure, but just to say that we recognize we're running a bit out of time, over time, but this is a very interesting and rich conversation, and there's still quite a number of questions. So I would suggest we go on for another 10 minutes and respond to this question. So Sasha, please pick up from where you left.
Thank you, Winnie. I was just saying it would be so interesting if we had some of the same thinking around, you know, if you don't, I just wonder why that kind of stereotypical thinking doesn't apply to things like generational wealth. You know, I mean, I think generational wealth is a huge problem in South Africa. You know, there are kinds of progressive ways to think about funding a BIG in South Africa, and it is possible, it is doable, especially when you look at some of these ripple out effects. You know, Guy Scanlon talks about a communist fund. You know, we need to be addressing, I think, corporate income tax non-compliance, which is massively high in this country. Yeah, and then progressive tax measures like Natasha was talking about. But what I want to get onto talking about, you know, Guy Sanning's model of the communist fund, and in so many others, what we see is that a BIG would initially require quite substantial funding to get off the ground, but basically it would start to be able to pay for itself, and it would do that really quickly. So when we look at, we make so many cuts to socioeconomic rights.
Losing you again. But I think you were saying something about, and initially the UBIG would require significant investments, but it's sustainable thereafter. I think that's what you were trying to say. So I think if you move closer to the mic, we can hear you, but we lose you every time you move back a little bit.
Sorry, I kind of get into the flow of speaking. But, yeah, I mean, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought again, but I think that, yeah, I mean, this way in which it pays for itself is a really important point. But this is what's really like the nub for me, right? We as a country, we say things are bad, we have to make really hard decisions, right? So we cut public spending, which often goes towards the performance of socioeconomic rights. And I mean, we've seen this extensively. I mean, commentators have spoken about it extensively, and I don't really have the space to speak to that in detail here. But yeah, I mean, so, yeah, sorry, I don't know why I keep losing my train.
Okay,
The difficult decision, it's an important point to make, so I will pick up on it again, but the difficult decision to make should be spending towards the performance of social.
Sorry, Sasha, we're losing you again. And people would really like to hear you. They're very interested in this, but I think you're having some issues with mic. So I would suggest that you also, for some of those important issues that you were trying to raise, perhaps you could put them on the chat box so that people can see the points you're trying to make.
Maybe just to quickly sum up, spending money is always a hard thing to do, but we should spend it in a way where it will benefit the people and the economy. And that's, to me, is a no-brainer.
Okay. So I think the question here seems to be the fact that people struggle. It's difficult to convince people about the importance and the question of financing and the affordability of a UBIG. And I think one of the questions that has come up, I think, twice is how we convince people who, particularly the middle class and the privileged, and how do we change people's perceptions towards social transfers, towards a universal basic income grant? How do we change, how do we convince them that it's necessary? I think we'll start with you, Natasha.
convinced that the people we have to convince are the extremely privileged. The pilot studies that have been done are immensely useful and valuable at providing information about how the provision of an income guarantee increases kind of community care, relationships within communities, and I think the biggest proponents of an income guarantee are those who have taken part in the pilot programs. And I think that's one of the things that we need to do. We need to listen to more people who have been part of income guarantee programs to hear the ways that it has affected their lives for better or for worse. I think we also need to acknowledge that what we currently have is not working. So we are also in a moment where there's a necessity for what is going to be experimentation, because we are going to be trying things that haven't on a large scale, a kind of countrywide scale, been done before. But it is clear that what is currently there is not working. So we need to figure out possibilities and alternatives. The other thing is that people need time in order to advocate, to do political work, to do organizing, to speak to community members, to have broader based meetings, and to really have democracy in action. And if you are working 12 hours a day, including transport to get to and from work, those kinds of spaces are very difficult to make and create. You're choosing between using some of your Saturday, which you might have been doing other kinds of work on, or hanging out with your children, or leaving your children alone, to get together with those around you in order to organize. And an income guarantee would provide us with a certain amount of space to communally engage about ways that we can make a better society, a better world. Now, I don't know if that way is permanently going to be an income guarantee from the state to the citizenry. It might not be, but an income guarantee allows us the space to free up the time to engage better as collectives, in order to be able to do the work for what would make our lives better. The rich have a lot more time, unfortunately, to be thinking through these things right now. And what we don't often have the time to do is, and people make the time, don't get me wrong, it's not like people aren't doing this political work and this organizing, people are, but it's at the expense of choosing between this or leisure, choosing between this and an extra piece job, etc., etc. So I think a basic income guarantee would give us the space to make more collective decisions about what's better for our society. And I just wanted to answer one of the questions that came into the box, which was why a basic income grant? Or why not better services? Why not an increasing of already existing grants? The first thing is to say that we really have to let go of a thinking that is about this or something else. It's completely possible, and in fact fundamental, that we have a basic income grant alongside state provisioning. We do need good hospitals. We do need good schooling, free. We do need all of these things alongside a basic income grant, and we cannot allow a provision of a basic income grant to foreclose those necessities, those state social provisions. But a basic income grant compared to the existing state social grants means that those who are aged between 18 to 59 will be able to receive an income. They currently fall outside of the child support grant or the old age grant. It also means that there's no means test connected to your grant, and that's that's one of the fundamental things that will challenge the system that needs us to prove that we're deserving, right? We no longer have to say that we're poor enough, we're needy enough. A basic income grant would flatten that. Now, there is the important question, which is that people who are living with disabilities or people who have additional financial requirements might earn less money. And that is something that we do need to think about. We do need to think about additional resources and how we're going to distribute those in addition to an income guarantee, if it were to mean that other grants would be decreased or no longer exist. But those are things that we can work out once the fundamental premise that an income guarantee from state to state to the people who live in a place is guaranteed.
Thanks, Natasha. I think I want to move on to the next question, which is sort of related to the issue brought up about other forms of social support within the welfare system. And just drawing on your work, what would you say are the lessons, the key lessons that government and civil society need to consider as we debate the Universal Basic Income Grant? For example, we know that the Child Support Grant has been of huge benefit, particularly for children, but there have been criticism around the value of the grant not being adequate enough. There are also questions about the administration of the grants and the effects of privatization of the whole system around grants on people, on the beneficiaries. So I would like to hear what you think are the main lessons that we need to take into this discussion around the BIG. And this is a question that both you and Sasha can respond to. So maybe we can start with Sasha and then finish up with Natasha.
Sure, thank you, Winnie. Yeah, so I really think that we need to think very clearly about what some of the implications of the reality that we exist in are. I mean, sorry, I'm jumping off some of the comments that I'm seeing come up in the chat box, but really, when you look at the structural chronic unemployment, when you look at things like youth unemployment levels, I mean, we've got an entire generation that just have absolutely no prospects and no kind of opportunity. So when we're talking about basic income grant, for me, what we're talking about is nurturing the full and radiant force of the people of this country. It's about.
We are losing you again. I'm so sorry that your connection is giving this discussion an issue. But I think if you move closer to the computer, we can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Melissa, do you mind just repeating your question quickly, and I'll jump onto that.
So I asked about what important considerations we need to take into account as we move forward with policy discussions about possible basic income grant.
So, what I was saying about, youth unemployment levels in this country, we're very good at turning a blind eye to the realities of our situation. When we hear the president talk about, we've got this great package to help COVID-19, or we really want to address the GBV crisis in South Africa. We have a lot of these kind of ideas of equity, ideas of democracy that we circulate and we kind of throw around, but are we actually seeing those impacts on people's lives? And I think that really what is happening is a massive squandering of human potential. And that's a really kind of unforgivable thing. And I think a reason why a UBIG or a BIG is so important in this country, in order to really kind of generate some of those opportunities. But I mean, I think that the biggest thing for me in terms of advocacy work around this is this idea of people getting something for nothing, and people being lazy, and that not being a dignified thing to get money without so-called putting in the work. When you see how I really feel like there's such incredible economic expertise in this country, because people have to take such small amounts of money and stretch them so far. I mean, we really have so many economic experts you know, making their lives work and finding these forms of like vital resistance where their lives kind of come up against these systems, you know. So, you know, I think that there's a lot that circulates around all of this, but those are quite important things for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Natasha.
Hi, Winnie. What's the question that I'm responding to?
So this was a question about what lessons we need to take with us as we consider or in policy discussions around universal basic income. And we know that there have been limitations with, and challenges, particularly for some of the other grants like the child support grant. But what lessons can we take as we move forward into discussions on the UBIG?
So the first thing is for us to, while we need to be critical, we need to also acknowledge that a certain amount of space has been opened up by Minister Lindiwe Zulu, as well as those who've been campaigning and working really hard to get the BIG at the forefront of discussions. And we need to use this moment, this fundamental moment, to push for an income guarantee. In times of crisis and pandemic, we know that a lot of really violent right-wing policies can be rolled out. If not policies, then actions, a lot of time both. But part of the reason for that is that moments of crisis allow space for movement. And we need to make sure that we mobilize as far as possible to take the space that this really horrific moment of crisis might be able to permit us. In doing that, we have to understand that the BIG needs to constantly be put out there as a demand that also questions the underlying ideologies of neoliberal capitalism, which is that productivity is good, that you don't get something for nothing, that work only looks like ABC. And we need to really question those things. That competition is good, we need to question that. We need to question that you doing that. We need to really draw attention to the fact that some are only able to be so rich because others are so poor, etc. And I think we do that concurrently with a basic income grant. Getting a basic income grant is not the end of any sort of program of social justice and structural justice, but it is an important moment for it to be part of it. And for us to use the space, exactly like IEJ and yourself and Sonia and others are doing, to really use this moment of pushing for a big, to open up conversations about the failures of neoliberalism, the failures of work as we see it today, and really the gendered and powered inequalities of work and of the system as it currently is.
Thank you, Natasha. I think now to finish up, I'll ask one question that came up actually from Sonia about post-COVID futures. And given all that we've discussed today about feminist perspectives around basic income grants, do you think with COVID-19, the pandemic has opened up the space for feminist alternatives, or have we not learned as a society? Should we be optimistic for a better society? Perhaps, Asha, we could start with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a dismal failure right now. You know, it's a total humanitarian crisis. And earlier I was talking about all of you know, this government kind of speak around the importance of this issue, but really we don't see what the realities of this issue are. Really, we will talk about the second pandemic while not allocating anything to gender-based violence or you know, I get really wary around a promise to exploring the idea of the BIG. For me, that's a good step in the right direction, but it doesn't go far enough. You know, and I think that this returns to some of my, you know, the comments that I was making earlier about just having to exist and having to continually exert this force. Like, these vulnerabilities exist. These, you know, these. I think that so much of the work that we have to do is still trying to prove that that exists, and that's so fundamentally exhausting, and means additional labor from people who are oppressed. But yeah, I mean, we are not seeing any sort of adequate social provisioning for the vulnerabilities that existed during apartheid colonialist times, which we still see existing today. We don't see it before COVID-19, and we certainly don't see it in terms of COVID-19. I think this is the echo from the IEJ commented that it's only 1% of GDP was kind of funded by the stimulus package. So I think that's a really small amount to be kind of putting towards social provisioning. It's as if all of this is just seen as completely excluded from the important serious discussion. When we're talking about balancing debt to GDP ratio, we need to be crunching through thousands of numbers and coming up with these complicated formulas. Actually, you know, debt to GDP ratio, if you look at how people spend and transfer money hand to hand, that can give you a lot of information. You know, so really, we're not seeing adequate social protection. We desperately need the immediate implementation of the basic income grants, along with some of the other measures that Natasha pointed to, along with grant reform, raising child support grants to at least like the food poverty line, to address some of the issues of stunting. I think there's a lot of trauma in this country, and we have this ability to, you know, just kind of blindside these aspects and compartmentalize. You know, I'm speaking as a white middle class person, compartmentalize things quite well and keep things quite neatly over there somewhere else, you know. And that's done as well by excluding a feminist and rigorous scientific, intersectional, standard view perspective as something external too, you know. Really, we need to be looking at the most vulnerable. The position of the most vulnerable in our society is the position, speaks to the position of all of us. If the most vulnerable are protected, then everyone is protected. And we really need to be looking at the people who are most vulnerable at this time. And yeah, it's just radically inadequate. I mean, we need to be doing so much more. And I think that BIG is a really fundamental part of that.
Thank you so much, Sasha. So still a lot to do. Natasha, what are your concluding remarks around this?
Just a concluding remark is to say thank you so much to those people who attended. I know I thank the organizers, but I know that one can get webinar fatigue during this moment. And I think that as keeping the conversation of UBIG open and widening it is so fundamental at this moment. And I'm really grateful for people who are engaging on it. The second one is that the Pay the Grants campaign is ongoing. We will be discussing we continue discussing a lot of these things and connecting it to organizing around grants. So if you do want to get involved, my email address is in the chat box. But I want to say that I really think we need to start figuring what true solidarity and dependence can be. And I think an income guarantee is one part of thinking about how it's not a bad thing to be dependent, that we need to depend on each other. The pandemic has shown us that we need each other to live, to thrive, to survive, to have fun, to cope. And an income guarantee is one way of us sharing and thinking of dependence as a good thing and interdependence as fundamental and something that we're already doing, but something that we can do in a way that is more just.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you so much to Sasha as well. I mean, it seems to be concluding, to summarize everything that you said, is that having a universal basic income grant is a great opportunity to actually bridge the gender inequalities, racial inequalities, all sorts of inequalities across different individuals in South Africa. And it's something that the government should definitely take seriously and implement for adults in this country. I think we've had a lot of very interesting questions and the contributions from the audience. I'll also take an opportunity to thank them as well. And to say that, just to emphasize that you can reach either of the panelists. They both shared their email addresses, so we would like to engage with them further around some of the issues they've raised. I know there were quite a number of questions around theory and neoliberalism that we didn't get to cover, so I think this conversation can continue. And also just to say that this is just the second IEJ seminar on post-COVID futures, and there will be another one on the 5th of October. And the discussion is going to be on what a post-COVID-19 economic recovery should look like. So tune in and subscribe to the IEJ newsletter in order to get updates on that. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Natasha and Sasha, once again, and to the IEJ for hosting this webinar. Thank you and goodbye.